Right, so good afternoon, everyone. Always good to be here. This is an update on some of the modeling work that I've been doing to investigate how the lunar exosphere responds to the release of exhaust gases during a powered descent. My co-author Dana Hurley and I are both at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab. We're members of the Dream 2 team led by Bill Farrell and the newly selected leader team led by our session chair, Rosemary. This is computational work, and all of the simulations that I'll share today were performed using the supercomputers at the Texas Advanced Computing Center, to which I had access through the NSF's EXCEED program. So the motivation behind this work lies in something that we've known for a long time, which is that almost any landed lunar mission is inevitably going to be an active volatile release experiment. This is something that was looked into during the Apollo era, primarily with a view to linking spacecraft contamination to sample collection procedures. It's something that's been revisited in the years since. And modeling plays a key role in linking observations to the physical processes that are acting and controlling the exosphere. And this question of how volatiles interact with the surface of an airless body is something that has a much broader implication for solar system science. In general, the most common kinds of exospheres in the solar system are those that are just barely there, and the lunar exosphere is the closest and one of the most interesting places to study those gas surface interactions. The interaction of volatiles with the surface is also critical to answering some of the outstanding questions we have about the processes that have written the lunar polar volatile record over time. Understanding how spacecraft alter the lunar environment is also critical to mission planning when it comes to determining how far you should rove before measuring surface volatiles and other questions. And then lastly, when it comes to looking at water as a potential resource, it's important not just to characterize its distribution and depth and laterally, but also the processes that control it. And in particular, there's this question of what timescales is this resource renewed on, and the interaction of water molecules and other volatiles with the surface is critical to answering that question as well. And so in this work, I focus on two more specific questions: how the lunar exosphere responds to a powered landing, and how sensitive things we can observe are to interactions taking place at those very small scales. So to make an exosphere from scratch, we consider a spacecraft propulsion system. If you specify a nozzle exit diameter, a thrust, combustion chamber conditions, what's being produced, what temperature and pressure is it at, you can have some starting conditions based on which to generate simulated molecules. And the simulations I do basically model gas dynamics by modeling a large number of representative molecules. I calculate conditions within a virtual source region, which is a sphere 40 meters in diameter, centered at the spacecraft, wherever it may be at a given instant in time. I assume that conditions in that region can be calculated based on the assumptions we make about the propulsion system and using a set of analytical expressions. And I generate these simulated water molecules. We then release the water molecules, and while all this is happening, the spacecraft is moving in time and space. We currently model a trajectory similar to that followed by the Chang'e 3 spacecraft. Once molecules are created and released into the lunar environment, they interact with the moon and its surroundings in a number of different ways. Molecules, in regions where the gas is dense enough, molecules can collide with each other and exchange internal and kinetic energy during that process, which we model using the direct simulation Monte Carlo method. In between collisions, and as the gas expands further away from the spacecraft, molecules undergo collisionless ballistic hops. When they land on the surface, I consider them to have a temperature-dependent surface residence time. We account for diurnal variations in temperature. On occasion, a molecule can pick up enough velocity that it hops out of the lunar gravity well, so we account for thermal escape. And then last but not least, we have photolysis. The sun is the great destroyer of water molecules. And so if we put all of that together, the first thing I want to show here is what happens during a nominal descent. So again, the trajectory, the spacecraft are similar to something on the Chang'e 3 scale. We consider a landing at 70 degrees south, which is where the next planned lunar landing by ISRO's Chandrayaan spacecraft is planned to take place. 7 a.m. gives you plenty of daylight to carry out whatever landed operations you may wish to carry out. Surface interactions, I describe surface interactions in a less sophisticated way than OJ and Bill and others have done, but through 3 parameters. Every molecule that hits the lunar surface is assumed to stick, even if only briefly. How long a molecule sticks for depends on the desorption activation energy. When a molecule leaves the surface, I assume 100% thermalization. So molecules accommodate completely to the local surface temperature. And so what you see here is a view of the water vapor plume at 5 seconds after thrusters have turned on. Blue here represents water molecules that are in the exosphere. Gray represents water molecules that have settled to the surface. So you're looking at a sort of sideways slice through the water vapor plume. The spacecraft here is not to scale. This is the descent trajectory, which is to scale. And just to orient you, this is the range of exospheric densities that you see. And so even 5 seconds after the thrusters have turned on, there is already a many orders of magnitude enhancement in exospheric density. Surface absorption depends on what you assume about interaction parameters, but for some perspective, I've outlined in white regions inside, the region inside which there's more than a monolayer of water vapor absorbed. We can also animate this, so you can see the spacecraft descending along the descent trajectory. The water vapor cloud expands outward, water falls back to the lunar surface, and so you're looking here at about 65 seconds, over which the bulk of the descent takes place. And so how do we relate all of this to things that we can actually observe? What we're trying to do is to build up a set of simulations in which we vary the different model parameters that are, to a large degree, still remain to be definitively constrained. So in the next few slides, we consider two scenarios, the same kind of landing, but the desorption activation energy varies between 0.5 and 0.7. And what that essentially does is to affect the balance between how much water is absorbed and how much water is mobile in the exosphere and migrating. And you can see that difference in density when the residence time at that local surface temperature is very small, most of the material remains mobile, and in contrast, at the end of the power descent, so this is after 155-second descent trajectory, thrusters have turned off, the spacecraft is very close to landing. By that time, most of the vapor that's been released so far has fallen back to the surface. And in this case, where the average residence time is on the order of 12 hours, it's still stuck to the surface. We can look at how much is stuck to the surface, and again, you can see a big difference caused by that difference in the assumed desorption activation energies. And just to put the numbers here in perspective, the region within which we have more than a monolayer is outlined here. LAMP observations have recently detected much smaller amounts of water at less than 1% monolayer surface coverage. So this is something that is potentially detectable and scientifically interesting if we can do so. We can also look at the column density, which is something that we're often able to observe. So this is the density in molecules per square centimeter. This is what you'd see if you were flying at 30 kilometers looking down, or if you were a mass spectrometer sitting on the surface looking up. You can see that in the vicinity of the spacecraft, the column density in the two cases where we vary activation energy is similar, but the way in which it falls off is significantly different. And there are some differences in the shape of the column density distribution as well. And again, for perspective, these are column densities that amount to many orders of magnitude enhancement in the typical background density of the lunar exosphere, which would be purple on this scale. It's comparable, generally higher than column densities that were detected in the aftermath of the L-cross impact. Exospheric science at Lander scale, I don't have the answer to this not quite question yet, but it's something that's interesting to think about. To give you some perspective of scale, this is sunrise over Schrödinger Basin. You can see shadows rising and falling as the sun rises in the sky. So to give you some perspective of scale, exospheric structure is generally determined by the ballistic length scale. So a single molecule typically travels a few hundred kilometers in a few hundred seconds. And so for perspective, a molecule can traverse Schrodinger basin in a few seconds. And so exospheric structure is generally very large scale, but there's something interesting that happens when molecules interact with a surface, because surface temperature is a key controller of the interactions that we're interested in. And so on the one hand, we have this large scale structure we can detect from orbit. When we're at the lander scale, molecules are responding to changes in temperature that occur over extremely small scales. So everywhere from the crater and basin scale right down to the millimeter scale. And so that it's interesting to think about the role that plays in interpreting observations that we may soon have the opportunity to analyze again with some of the CLIPS instrumentation. And then if we take a step back, spacecraft exhaust is just one among several ways in which spacecraft operations can alter the lunar environment. This is a figure that shows what happens when an astronaut with an outgassing spacesuit approaches a cold cathode gauge experiment. And you can see that in this case, the outgassing from the spacesuit literally overwhelmed the instrument. Dana, Medibena, and others have recently used micrometeoroids to get at the structure of hydration within the lunar regolith. This is not a micrometeoroid impact crater. It's the crater formed by the Apollo Saturn IV rocket stage when it impacted the moon. In a way, that's another kind of meteoroid. If we observe the exosphere during the time these events are happening, there is a very good chance that we can get important scientific and operational knowledge out of that. And then lastly, there's sample collection. This is nitrogen content versus soil maturity. The little guy that's right off the scale was collected right beneath the lunar module, where and these high nitrogen values are to some extent thought to be contamination by hydrazine, which was the fuel that the Apollos were using. We can also look at the long-term transport of volatiles. It's something I've shown here for a previous case, and the key takeaways here are that the global expansion of the exosphere, the rate at which it decays, are also sensitive to those surface parameters. And there's also diurnal variability. So if you had a little mass spec sitting on the edge of a PSR, you might expect to see diurnal variations in flux. And that's something that we're still exploring for the particular case of spacecraft exhaust. And so I'll leave conclusions up here, but this brings us back ultimately to the point that almost any landed lunar mission will be an active volatile experiment, and one that's very much worth investigating and observing for a number of reasons. Thank you.
Right, first question here.
Hi, Parvathy, it occurs to me that if you modify your code to put in not just water, but say, assume a certain amount of the waters will come off as OH and a certain number H2O, and then you can predict the exosphere as a function of the interaction of the water with the surface. Then when you have measurements, then you can say, okay, we can constrain what's actually happening to the water.
Yeah, that's something that we could do. So you pointed out an important thing, which is that right now I'm only modeling the H2O, and including both some of the other exospecies as well as what happens to even just that H2O is, I think, something that would be interesting to do.
Okay, good. We've got 3 questions. One, then David.
Hey, Parvathy. Thanks. Nice talk. I was just wondering why you're focused so much on descent as opposed to ascent, and if there's an asymmetry there, and what that would be.
That's a good question. So, I guess one reason is simply that a lot of the first landers are kind of going to stay there, and so the ascent doesn't happen. That's really the main reason. There's also, another simplification I make here is that I don't consider any mobilization of dust at all. That becomes important as you get to altitudes lower than around 10 meters. I don't go quite that low yet, but when you're considering ascent, maybe that initial mobilization of dust plays a bigger role than it does in descent.
Thank you. The plume from the motor is at the beginning in a continuum regime.
Yes.
Would this change the results from your DSMC approach?
Well, so DSMC can model the transition from continuum to free molecular. So if you look at the mean free path between collisions close to the plume, the continuum assumption is quite reasonable. And so that virtual source region there, I think it's reasonable to assume continuum conditions within that region, but then it's exactly for the reason you pointed out that we use something like DSMC to model that transition from continuum to completely collisionless. That's a really good point, though.
The first two talks of the session provided estimates for the amount of water detected telescopically and with m cubed. So my question is, how many CLIPS landers or of the classic 9 metric ton human lander will it take to overwhelm those signals?
That's a great question, David. And so that is one of the things that I'd like to answer with the longer term simulations. So most of the results I showed today focus on while the thrusters are on. So that's a couple of 100 seconds. What I'm in the process of doing is running those out further. The answer is the fudgy answer is that it depends on what you assume about gas surface interactions. If the surface is stickier, the exosphere generally sticks around on the surface for longer. So it depends to some extent, and it would be great if we could constrain that further by comparing models to observations during some of the first descents, so that we could get a better idea. But one lander, I don't think would do it permanently. Simply because the amount released for that class of lander is quite small. And if you spread that out globally, I don't know, we're talking about ppm, so perhaps, but something I hope to get a better handle on through the longer term simulations.
Right, so before we let you go, this question that's going on in my mind since the first talk is we are still not talking about the third dimension. So this is all the water hydroxyl. How deep from the lunar surface?
Right, so OJ might have a good answer to that because penetration depth is something that he considers. And the different, so someone else chip in here if you have better ideas while I'm just making things up. But the different instruments, m cubed and LAMP, are sensitive to water at different depths. Some of Dana Medibena's recent work has shown that there might be a relatively desiccated layer, a few centimeters thick, overlying a more hydrated layer. So there are suggestions that it's getting down fairly deep within the top meter or so, but that dimension is interesting, and I think it's a subject of research.
Okay. Right. Thank you. Yeah.